nice that I got to meet a bunch of you beforehand at the signing, so welcome and thank you for being here. So like Rebecca said, I can tell you things about the book, but it might be more interesting if you just ask what you have questions about, and I am open to questions not just about Dreamland or the story in it or the actual race massacre itself. If you have questions about publishing or whatever, anything you think I might know about, I'll tell you if I don't. So, who wants to kick it off? Yes?
So, I asked you kind of earlier, just when you were brainstorming and thinking about writing this story, did you always know that you wanted to do two different perspectives?
So, yeah, and that is a great question. And the answer is no. It took I spent about 2 years doing research on the race massacre itself. And in history books, it is referred to as the race riot, and everyone will know what you're talking about if you say that, but a lot of people in Tulsa prefer to call it a race massacre because the term riot implies that the African American community started it. It shouldn't, but in our popular culture, it just kind of does. So the numbers were, it was 10 white Tulsans to 1 African American Tulsan in 1921. So that's why it ended up being a massacre. But when I first started doing the research for the book, my primary concern was understanding what had actually happened. And there aren't really enough books out there that just explain what happened. So I spent those 2 years doing primary document research and digging and focusing on a lot of interviews with people who had survived the riot. That was the heart of my research right there. And when I started writing it, I write my way into books. I don't sit down and outline. So have you guys read, you probably haven't, but Stephen King's book on writing? He says that there are pantsers, like seat of your pantsers, and plotters. And I'm learning to plot, but this is the 4th book I've finished, the 2nd that was published. I'm really more of a pantser. So I start with the beginning and the end. I want to know where the book's going to end, and it's good to have an exciting middle point. And I even marked it. There's like a literal middle point in this novel. But when I started, the way I conceived of the book was with a teenage boy discovering a gun and a written long confession in his grandfather's Victrola machine. And the way I had originally conceived the book, he was a white teenager in Tulsa, in modern Tulsa. So that was where I started. So I was doing the research and writing at the same time, trying to kind of find the story that would take hold, that told the story I wanted to tell. And it didn't work. So I spent about 3 months literally sitting down and forcing out words with this single narrator that didn't work. So he eventually became Will, and Will lived in 1921, obviously, and not today. But I still hadn't switched over to incorporate the contemporary issues. The thing is that over the course of those 2 years, we had the first of 2 shootings of unarmed African-American men in North Tulsa by law enforcement officials. The first of those happened as I was really focusing on the plot and how am I going to make this come together. And that was when I saw the similarities between what had happened to that man in front of the Dollar General in North Tulsa and what had happened in 1921. And that's when Rowan, I realized I needed to pull this in, that this was not a story that was in the past, it's a story that's still happening. So it was very much an evolution. That's a long answer to a simple question, but it did take me a while to get there. Yeah. And you have a book, correct? Yes, I thought so, yeah. Oh, and I didn't repeat the question, and I said I would. I was supposed to repeat your question, but now we have a microphone.
It just goes to the camera.
I will repeat your question if the microphone doesn't work.
It goes to the camera.
Okay, why did you want to write a novel about this topic in the first place? Like, why did you choose the Tulsa Race Massacre in this, just to focus on that?
that was another evolving thing. The first book I wrote was just like a hard-boiled detective novel for teenagers with a girl protagonist. And I couldn't really find my comfort level. I was sort of fantasy, but that sucker had Valkyrie and vampires and all kinds of supernatural things in it. And that got pared out and pared out and pared out. And by the end, I realized it was this hybrid book that wasn't really what I had envisioned. So I was actually working on that manuscript. I was getting up at 5 in the morning every school day, and I would write for an hour and 20 minutes, and then I would wake the kids up. And then I would go to my one single year as a really horrible English teacher. I worked in a Montessori school. It was a combination 7th, 8th grade. I was not a good teacher, but they were desperate. They needed somebody, and we were broke. So we filled each other's needs for the year. But, oh my gosh, I totally got off track. Tell me your question again.
Why did you choose a certain topic?
Thank you. Thank you. So during that year, we went to visit the Greenwood Cultural Center in Greenwood. And if you've been there, I hope you visit. If you haven't, there is a hallway in the back that has black and white pictures of survivors of the riot or the massacre who had been children when it occurred, and they're in their 70s, 80s, and 90s in those pictures. And their eyes are really intense in those photographs. So they kind of followed me. And I knew basically what had happened. I had read a few New York Times articles about the massacre. And I had done some prep work to talk with the kids about it. But that was where I realized there were so many stories going on as this horrific event was occurring, and those stories are just gone. Some are still preserved. There are still interviews, written interviews, and some voice recordings. But I wanted to know those people's stories, and that's where I really dug into the research. And I knew that what I was doing, the previous book, wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. I found my love. I really love writing historicals. See, I can give really long answers. You guys don't even have to ask that many questions. I saw your hand first, yeah. And do you have a copy?
I don't. Oh.
We have 2, but I wasn't going to give away that we're giving them out until first. Yeah.
Thank you. How did those, because you said you did personal interviews with people who survived, how did those stories specifically influence the book?
I didn't actually have an opportunity to interview survivors myself. Most of them have passed. There is one, Dr. Olivia Hooker, lives outside New York City. She's one of the very few surviving victims of the riot. But what I listened to, I think when I listened to things I found through the Tulsa Historical Web Society, Tulsa City County Library, Voices of Oklahoma, when I listened to the survivor stories, I think what really stuck out to me was that it wasn't like a textbook. It wasn't like your 2 or 3 paragraphs that give a timeline in the critical events and boom, there it is. And if you've read the Oklahoma 9th grade history textbook, that really is the 2 tiny little 2, maybe 3 paragraphs. It's pretty bad. But it was, they were people, and I immediately identified not with their experiences, because I haven't thankfully had to go through anything that horrific, but just on a human level with them, and also as teenagers or children going through these events. So there was one story, I didn't hear this, this was written by a historian who interviewed a woman named Vernice Sims, and I think where it really kicked in, and I thought, yeah, this can be a young adult book, is Vernice lived in Greenwood. She was a junior at Booker T. Washington High School in 1921, and she'd never been allowed to date a boy by herself going out. Her dad was too strict. But the prom was supposed to be June 1st, and the actual burning of Greenwood took place on the 1st. So she was allowed to go. She got a dress made, and she helped decorate the hotel the night before. And then her father actually heard rumors that there was going to be violence and told their family, we're leaving until things get better, then we'll come back. By the time she got back, her house had been looted and burned. The hotel had burned. Thankfully, Booker T did not. It's one of the few buildings that didn't. But you talk about a story, and what she said was, this is looking back as an old woman, she said, I was really scared to walk the streets of Tulsa because I didn't know what I'd do if I saw a white woman wearing my dress. Like, she was afraid she would get in trouble, like do something serious because, and what girl isn't going to get that? If you're writing a book for teenagers, yeah, somebody stole my freaking prom dress and burned my house down. That's emotion, and I think that's so, to fictionalize, I didn't take any survivor stories and use them in the book as my own because that would be incredibly disrespectful and not my place. But it was an avenue to imagine experiences that I had been inspired by. That was really what made me think this can be a book that hopefully will make people want to go hear those survivor stories.
Did you pick who the skeleton was going to be before you wrote, or did that kind of evolve as you started writing?
So not everybody has read it, right? You don't know who the skeleton is. Okay. We'll try to fudge it. I'll do my best. I knew who I wanted the skeleton to be, but I didn't, until I got to the end, I wasn't sure that it would work. I needed to feel how the story had gone because I'm a pantser, so I was writing chapter by chapter. So in the end, it all worked out, but there were some plot changes that I had to make that work, and some forensic anthropology that I had to learn about, and literally there is some forensic anthropology in there that's very controversial, but it's nevertheless, it's pretty much established science, but it is controversial. And I needed that at the end to make my clues work out.
Okay, so in the story, there are obviously like multiple personalities going on there and a lot of different thought processes, even from like the side characters. And this is me making an assumption. You don't embody all of those characteristics and personalities. So what did you do, or how did you think about it so that you felt that you were doing it justice to write these types of personalities?
Sure, I'm a middle-aged white lady, and right? And there are Osage characters in the novel, and African American, and if you've been to Tulsa, you know that Tulsa is a really diverse city, and it was founded by diverse peoples. It was founded by Native Americans and African Americans and white Anglo-Americans. So and that's a very tricky question, and it's a little frightening, honestly, when you go to write a book for teenagers, because there's a lot out there that's not done respectfully. So one, I assumed when I went in writing that I might jack it up. That's, if you guys have read Junot Diaz, he's like, and he was talking about writing female characters, and he's aware that that's difficult for him. He said, just know if you write outside of your own ethnic or gender group, you're gonna jack it up, and you're probably gonna jack it up epically. So when you get the pushback, listen to it and make the next one better. So I went into it with that assumption that I would make mistakes. Fortunately, and I will get to your question about what I did to get there, I did have sensitivity readers, many sensitivity readers. So I had 3 African American readers, including some people who were in Tulsa, as well as 2 tribal members who were Osage, but also some Native Americans in Tulsa who were Cherokee. And I was very careful and very grateful for their feedback to make sure that I hadn't jacked it up too epically. And they gave me good feedback. And in fact, in some cases, so Sunday Frazier writes books more for middle schoolers, and she said, she's actually half white, half African American, probably not exactly divided, there's no way to do that anyway, but she said, you didn't write about Rowan's hair at all. Rowan thinks about her hair. And I'm like, I can't do that. But she pushed and said, you need to at least mention her hair because she would think about that. So that feedback got incorporated. But in terms of putting myself in the shoes of people, obviously, I've never been African American or Native American. I've never been a man. I'm not trying to equate those, they're very different. But it's my job as a writer to put myself into the shoes of the characters I'm imagining. And I like to go into it thinking that I am not writing a character who represents the end-all, be-all of any experience. It's a character who's a composite of my imagination and what I observe and what I imagine. So these are fictional entities. They don't actually exist. But at the same time, I had models. So Rowan's mother is actually based on Andrea Pinckney, who is an editor at Scholastic and writes kids' books, and she is absolutely terrifying. And she's just like Rowan's mother, and I've met her at conferences, and she's wonderful. But I try to think of people who embody qualities that I want to convey. And Rowan herself is based on my daughter's friends, and her experience in particular when she goes to the funeral to the person, I won't reveal it, when she goes to the funeral at the end, or after the funeral, when she walks in and says she felt like she finally belonged, because she was she appeared African American to everybody, she's biracial, and she went to a predominantly white school, that when she walked into that room, she felt like she belonged because she physically resembled everybody in the room. That was from things that I had talked about with my daughter's friends, who went to a private school with my daughter, where there were 2 girls in her class, and they were both African American, and they were the black kids in the school. Then they went to Booker T. Washington High School, which is more than half African American, and they said, oh, it was so awesome to walk into that cafeteria and have that experience of, I look like at least half the people in this room. So I did my job as best I could, imagined myself into circumstances, and relied on input from other people and their inspiration.
We've got some questions on this side.
Yeah.
So I kind of have 2 questions. So maybe the second one will be like quickly answered.
Just remind me if I forget one of them, okay?
Okay. So my first question is, why Dreamland? After some study, I found that there were several other theaters in the vicinity. So I'm wondering, why did you name it Dreamland? And then the second question that I have is, I noticed some of the names that you named some of the characters revolve around counties and towns. And I don't know if that was on purpose.
That was an accident.
Okay, because like I live in Tillman County, that's where I grew up,
Oh.
and then 50 minutes away there's a town called Gould, and that's one of the final characters at the end of the story, so I was wondering that.
I heard about Tillman County after I'd written the book, and then I thought, well, that's cool, that works.
You did great.
Now go back and remind me of the first question.
Why Dreamland?
Oh.
Why did you name the book Dreamland Burning? Because there were several other theaters within the vicinity.
Yeah, there were 2 in Greenwood, because I think that if you look at the history of what the Greenwood area of Tulsa represented, it was this amazing, it was called Black Wall Street. It was the most prosperous African American community in the country, and it was a dreamland. And since I'm not an Oklahoman, I moved here in 2001, and I consider myself one now because I've lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else by far. I went back and I needed to teach myself basic Oklahoma history, which you guys, if you're working with 3rd graders, you guys probably know way more Oklahoma history than those third graders do than I did when I moved here. So it was really interesting to read about how enslaved peoples came with the 5 tribes as slaves, and after they were emancipated, settled together and created these communities. And then I love that there were African Americans in the land rush, and that more people came here for opportunity, and that at one point there was a hope that this would be an all African American and Native American state. I didn't know that when I moved here. That is not what you think of when you live in Rhode Island and you see Oklahoma on the news. So I think I'm grateful to the man who bought the 40 acres that became Greenwood, and he would only sell to African American business owners and homeowners. So he really set up that area, and it was the spirit and the entrepreneurship of the African Americans who moved there and made it this amazing, thriving community. And it wasn't completely unique in the country, but it was pretty darn unique, and it was a dreamland. And I think that it was envy of that dreamland, in part, that drove people up to destroy it, or try to destroy it. It came back. Yeah.
But why did you choose to write a young adult book and aim it towards teenagers rather than an adult book?
That's all I've ever wanted to write. I said I didn't live places very long. I grew up in the Army. Well, I wasn't in the Army, but I got dragged around. And when that happens, you either become really outgoing and funny or interesting, or you get really quiet. And I went the quiet route, and I read books. And I'm old, so in the 70s and early 80s, there were not a lot of young adult books. So I read adult books, but I processed them at the level of a high schooler. So this whole YA phenomenon just blows me away. I think it's wonderful. And YA has some of the most really cutting edge forms and topics out there in fiction now. Plus it's plot driven, which is what I prefer. Adult fiction, literary adult fiction focuses much more on the language. And sometimes you're like, what did I just read a book about? It was beautiful, but what was it about? So I knew I wanted my book to be story driven. I knew I wanted it to be something that a teenager like I was, who was perfectly smart enough to read adult books, but didn't necessarily want to read the books that were written for adults. That's what I've always wanted to do. And I love teenagers, they can handle the tough stuff. And this is a book about tough stuff. So, yeah. Did you have a copy? No. You got it. I didn't miss anybody who didn't have a copy and ask a question, right? Okay. There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So I'll be a high school teacher.
Uh-huh.
How do you hope that if your book gets utilized with, 8th grade and above, how do you hope that it will be utilized in a high school setting?
It has been to some extent, and 8th grade is a good place to start it. It's been in a 7th grade room that I know of. What I would really love to see is the book being used interdisciplinarily. Is that a word? But this is social studies, it's history, it's language, it's English. And it's also, there's a lot of research behind this book, and I tried to give teachers some toeholds into that in the author's note. I need to sit down. My publisher has not yet put together a teaching guide, an educator guide, which is driving me nuts because I would love for that to be there for tools for teachers. But so apart from integrating topics across subjects and helping students understand that fiction and literature and history and the humanities as a whole, they all support each other, I would really love to see the book used to open up honest discussions in classrooms. Not, oh, let's talk about how well this book did things, but I would love to have students come in and say, I didn't think that was true, and have a discussion about that, or that didn't feel right to me, or this made me wonder about this. So I would love for the book to be part of those really terrifying, if you're a teacher in front of a room full of kids and you don't know what's going to come out of their mouths. I want those hard discussions to happen, and if this book can help those discussions begin, then I will, that's as good as it gets.
On that same note, I was going to ask if, as a teacher, how would you think that this book would help students learn about the race riots in a human perspective as opposed to the textbook perspective? I haven't read the book. I don't own a copy, so I'm just guessing.
I really hope it does. So do I want the book to help students learn about the race massacre from a human perspective rather than from just a textbook-based perspective? And yes, absolutely. I didn't love history as a student growing up, and I had some great teachers, but this is also, we're talking a long time ago, straight up history textbooks don't inspire you a lot of times. There are timelines to memorize. You have to spit back the facts and the explorers' names. Someday I have to write an exciting book about, like Vasco da Gama. I know his name, but I can't tell you what he did. Probably something horrible. So yes, absolutely, because what I'd love to happen is for people to say, after they read Dreamland, this interested me, this didn't, I wonder more about that. I really want people to go back and listen to those survivor stories. And that then makes you wonder, okay, well, how does this fit with World War II? And how does it, because it does, or I'm sorry, World War I, that there were a lot of veterans coming back, unemployed veterans, trained veterans living in Greenwood who had guns and knew how to fight back. So there's so much that you can branch out from, not just the race massacre itself, which way too few people know about. But then maybe you find a student who's interested in learning about the Red Summer of 1919, where there were riots in Chicago and St. Louis and all over the country. So yeah, I hope it's a starting point and makes students want to read those history textbooks.
So you said you like writing like historical fiction. What's like another, do you have another topic that you want to write about? Would you keep it young, like adults, like what?
I do, yeah. I have a couple. I want to write a book about Calamity Jane because I want to do an old Western. And I'm working on right now, this is why World War II came out, that's what I've been researching. There aren't a lot of World War II books set on the US home front from the perspective of kids living here. So you've got The Book Thief, which is amazing, but that's Germany, that's not. So that is what I'm working on now. And I have a lot of World War II history, because like I said, I wasn't a history student. And World War II buffs know their facts. So that's what I'm digging into now and learning all about this. Rhode Island it's set in Newport, Rhode Island. It was this entire military state that there were submarine bases and PT boat, and it was just amazing. So see, I get all excited about the research.
Would you say that you learned more about yourself as a person through writing this? Wow. As a person through writing this book, or as a writer?
Wow. That is a teacher question. You're going to be a good teacher. I think if I had to pick one or the other, I would say I learned more about myself as a writer, because this was not an easy book to write. Just structuring the mystery that goes back and forth. It was also the oldest book I'd written. The others that I've done are skew younger. But as a person, before the middle-aged white lady puts out a book with diverse characters, you think long and hard about how you're going to answer questions about why you did that and why you felt you could. So in that sense, that was good. I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I've had some wonderful discussions with high school students about that. But also, since I never had a place that I thought was home, the weird thing was the massacre was horrific, and that didn't help me love Oklahoma anymore. But the research I did surrounding that, I know so much more about my town and my community now. And through the process of doing that research and thinking through the story, Tulsa really became my home. So, and that was a gift. That was an unexpected gift. Yeah.
Did you write back and forth, or did you kind of go like all of William's story and then all of Rowan's, or was it more back and forth or some of both?
It was 98% one chapter at a time, alternating voices. There were a few instances where a chapter ran really long from one perspective and I broke it up. But because Rowan and James were working backwards in time and Will was going forward in time, it was really hard to decide where to place clues. And sometimes clues would just happen while I was writing. I didn't have a list of clues to give out. So there was that. I had to spool out the clues so that no chapter would get ahead of the other. And the other thing, some reviewers have said that it flows well, that sometimes that format doesn't work, but in this case it did. And I think that is because I wrote chapter by chapter, because what I would realize was that when you do editing, you go and find word repetitions and your editors help you do that and get rid of those. But I would find echoes of things that happened in Will's chapter and then they'd happen in Rowan's chapter. So I think that the echoes, it was because my head was in that place from writing it. So they were unconscious, but in a way those plot echoes, I think, helped blend it. So the one I'm working on now, the first half, it starts from 3 perspectives, then goes to 2, and at the middle it goes to just the 3 kids are together. But I'm finding the same thing, that I really have to work one than the other.
How did you decide who would be the one to like reveal everything at the end? Like, how did you decide who to let do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, since it started as the confession letter from the grandfather, I had always envisioned it being the character who ended up being Will. I spent a lot of time figuring out, I wanted it to be him telling it in his voice, and it felt weird to me to tie the two together with Will just, I'm going to tell my story, and then this person is telling her story. So I wanted a way to concretely tie them together. And the Victrola, so I did a lot of research on Victrolas and model numbers and the prices. And in the course of that, I learned that there were these dictaphones, and I have a picture in a slideshow somewhere, but they were these big wax cylinders that secretaries that businessmen, because it was 21, would use to dictate their letters, and the secretaries could listen to it. They were recorded in the wax on the cylinder, and then they could be reused. So the secretaries had machines that would shave off the outer layer of wax, and then they could be reused maybe 30, 40 times. So part of it was just the history geek, the emerging history geek in me that was like, that's cool. He could have actually recorded his voice. And I have 2 of the cylinders I found at a junk shop in Tulsa, so they sat on my desk as I was writing. Yeah.
Okay, so I know you said that not a lot of people knew about this, and I'm from Oklahoma and had no idea this happened. So was the goal of you writing this to educate people more of what happened, or what was your end goal in writing this?
Since it's fiction, I didn't want to make the book feel like I was educating people, and that's actually a really hard thing when you do a lot of research. You want to sit down and tell the world all these cool things you read, and then you realize that's boring. There is great narrative nonfiction, but that wasn't what this was. So I had to cull a lot of the facts out. And tell me I'm getting off track again. Tell me the exact question again so I make sure I answer it.
Okay, so what was your goal in writing the book? What did you want to get out of it? Yeah.
I did want to get the story out there, but I think as a writer, your goal is always to tell a good story that's going to engage your readers. This happened to be a story that people just didn't know about, so I wanted to get out there. I trusted myself as a researcher enough to know that I would do a good job with getting the facts straight, and I'm confident in that. Those historical facts are as accurate as they can possibly be given how much was destroyed after the massacre. And I just lost the question again, and I did it, and say it one more time. Thank you. The end goal, honestly, once I got to the middle of the book, I realized I just want kids or adult readers, whoever picks this up, to go find the actual survivors telling their stories. I want people to care about what happens. So I want them to be emotionally invested in a good story so that they can go then learn the real history. Yeah. You guys, I will tell you, I am just spacey today. I was leaving Tulsa and I turned onto the exit ramp for 75 instead of the on-ramp, and thankfully there was a trucker there. I get in this weird headspace, and yesterday I was working on a talk and I was working on a manuscript, and my kids will come home from school and they'll say, "You're writing today, aren't you?" Because I'm wandering around the kitchen like not knowing what I'm doing. So you're catching me in prime author weird headspace mode.
What are some of the reactions or responses from a lot of like the high school kids that you said you've talked to? Like, what are they usually like? What do they think about the book, or like, how do they respond to the end of it, or what have you learned from them from that?
I don't know what they say when they're by themselves, but so far it's been good. This was a required summer reading book for the students at Booker T. Washington in Tulsa. And I had kids really excited. They also, you guys will appreciate this as teachers, I went to talk at the school. It was the entire freshman class. They turned them loose with two teachers. And we were in the auditorium. So that was like free period for half the kids there. So that gave me a slightly biased view. But it was a rowdy discussion because they were off talking having their own conversations. So they did enjoy it. The kids who enjoyed it. They had great questions. They had hard questions, and those are the best kind. So they were great. The very first high schools I visited to talk about this were actually in Washington, D.C. And they were both predominantly African-American schools. I hadn't talked about this book at all. And basically what I did was go in and tell the story of the massacre. And at both schools, the kids just sat there like, and I'd hear a couple, nuh-uh, and no way, because they hadn't heard it at all. So the very fact that this horrific thing had happened engaged them. They hadn't even read the book. But I'm hopeful that once they read the story, then yeah, they'll keep learning. It feels like you guys are all passing the speaking stick or whatever you use.
Would you say it was harder to write like Rowan's perspective than Will's?
Yes.
I was gonna
You
say
nailed it.
probably.
Yes. Will spoke in my grandfather's voice. My grandfather was from central Pennsylvania, which is where Will's dad would have actually come from, so Will would have his speech patterns. And honestly, Will was seen on the streets. He came off as white, even though he was half Osage. And Rowan does not. Rowan, when people see her, they assume African American. So not only did I have to be much more careful and thoughtful with Rowan's character, but like I said, Rowan's character came from girls I actually knew, and I wanted to do it right for them so they wouldn't read the book and go like, what are you thinking? So yes, I was more conscious with Rowan in choosing how her plot proceeded, but also Rowan scared me more.
How did you feel at the end of the story, like whenever you were finally done? Like, was it kind of a feeling of like relief, or were you sad? Like, did you get like really attached to the characters? Because I know a lot of us did. Yeah. But I like don't know what it's like actually writing it. Like if you have the same feelings or.
So is it a hard thing or a sad thing when you're finally done? I will give you, this may be a longer answer than you want. So there's the day you finish your first rough draft. And you send it off to your editor, and maybe 3 or 4 months later they send it back with this massive 10-page single-space letter that tells all the structural things they want to see changed. So I won't even go through the process, but this book was bought on a proposal. So I gave them the first 2 of each, 2 Rowan chapters, 2 Will chapters, and a summary. I did have to outline for them. And I had a year to write it, which I did, and finished that draft, had 2 different editors, and then a third, because it's crazy in publishing. There was never a point where I said, I'm done. And I would do a revision, and then little tweaks would come back. And I'll tell you a few revisions. So I had one editor, and most editors in publishing, especially in young adult, are women between 28 and 35 when they leave or do other careers. She grew up on Long Island. She'd never been to Oklahoma. And there's a scene where Rowan describes a room as looking like a room from the Smithsonian. And she wrote back and said, is it really realistic that a teenage girl from Tulsa would know what a room in the Smithsonian looks like? Yeah. So there's that. And right up, when you actually have to, there is a point where my publisher, not all publishers do, they mail me a copy of the printed manuscript in its layout with all the formatting, everything. And you have to sign it and say, I don't want you to make any more changes. And you get to keep a copy for yourself. The step right before that is when the formatting is there, you can't change the pagination on your book. So the word that begins page 21 has to stay the same, and the word that ends page 21 has to. I had not done my homework on how to drive a Model T Ford. So in the car chase scene, I had Will just shifting and using a clutch because I do know how to drive standard. They don't do that in a Model T. I had a historical fact checker. She didn't catch this, but I had written that scene all wrong. So I have like 2 pages worth of text. I can't change the paragraph structure or the the pagination. I spent a day watching YouTube videos on how to drive a Model T Ford, and then I spent another 2 days building sentences, changing what was there, but building them almost down to the syllable with the same construction, because I couldn't change it. So it really never does end. And then once the book is out there, then you're going to get feedback from people who may like it, who maybe didn't. You've given up that control, but the characters never really go away. And honestly, I've heard a couple of you guys talking about the characters as if they're real. That is so amazing. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I know it came as a shock to me that Vernon was actually African American too. So what made you want to make that twist that he wasn't white? Because he was so racist.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I'm so sorry. I was just curious.
That's okay. Well, there might be more spoilers. No, that's okay. That's okay. That's okay. It was, but I'll try to give you as an oblique an answer as I can. So part of it was structural to the plot. I needed that forensically. And so some, writers, people ask questions thinking we can really give them an honest answer, or how did you decide that so-and-so would do this? And you're like, I don't know, I pulled it out of my butt while I was writing that day. And that's the real truth, even though, yeah, there's stuff going on in your head, obviously, but I don't necessarily have access to that. So when I'm writing and I get in this weird headspace, at the end of the day, I have a glass of wine to shut my brain down, or something stronger. And then during this book especially, I watched so many Law and Order episodes, not the new one, because there are always dead babies in that, and I will not watch a dead baby mystery, but the old school Law and Orders, and there is an episode of Law and Order. And I was like, oh, that's it. That's the real honest answer. You didn't give away everything. You're good.
Okay, so I'm sure you've been asked this already, but do you ever hope that this is turned into a movie or a TV show or a Netflix miniseries?
Yes.
Because I would love it. Watch it for sure.
Yes, I do. It does have a film agent who has shopped it. I haven't gotten a no yet from Spike Lee, so he's still out there, and Denzel Washington both. The chances of it happening are really slim, and when you sign a book contract, your agent negotiates different elements for you. So in my contract for this book, I have world translation rights. So my agent worked with an Italian agent, and there's going to be an Italian version of Dreamland, which is so cool. And she also works with this film agent, and he's shopping it. The problem is, even if a studio or a producer decides that they want to acquire the rights to produce that, they're going to write you as small a check as they can get away with, and they can get away with very small, and say, we reserve the right to use this material, and they'll pay for, say, 3 years. So I know someone who has sold rights to multiple things. She wrote Gallagher Girls, and Gallagher Girls has been under contract with a studio forever, and they keep writing her little checks to keep it under contract. But they can't get a script. They can't get a script that'll work. They can't get someone who actually is willing to make the movie. And so it goes on and on and on. Now, sometimes it does happen, and it just, lightning strikes and it goes through. I would be thrilled if that happened. But you also then, when you sell it as a movie, somebody else is going to rewrite it for you, which is also, in this case, I think it would be really interesting to have a writer of color work on a TV or a movie version. It would be really interesting to see what they chose to do.
Who else has a question?
I had a question as a teacher again. I'm a social studies teacher, and some of us in this room are, and we don't always get to read books in class, and especially historical fiction. So what would you say to a teacher or maybe parents who might challenge us as social studies teachers for using historical fiction in a social studies class?
So how would you respond to parents who are challenging you about that you shouldn't use it in a social studies class? It's always the parents, seriously. I was a school psychologist, and the kids were awesome, but the parents, some of them were great. I don't honestly know, because that is just a sad idea to me that a parent would, one, question a teacher's decision on what to use in their classroom, but two, that a parent wouldn't just know, oh yeah, this is what's going to engage my child and make them care about this subject. But maybe you just have to break it down. I don't know. I don't know what communication lines are open with the parents in your room, whether you're doing posts online and they can go check stuff or not. But one thing I've learned writing is that things that I write that I think are totally crystal clear and don't you get it, people will be like, I missed that completely. So maybe as a teacher, you just have to break it down and say, this, this, and this. This is why I'm doing this. And this will help your child score better on this test. Finish up with that. Does that help? I wish I had more for you.
Other questions?
Is anybody interested in writing? Yeah, good, good, good. Are you guys doing younger stuff, middle grade or older?
I love to write picture books.
Picture books, good. And
I finished an introduction for young adults, kind of like young, well, probably like high school / junior high age.
okay. Yeah, it's tricky. You don't know where a book is going to fall on the spectrum, and that's the agent and editor's job, which is a nice thing. You just write your book. Picture books are such an amazingly tricky thing. If you want to do that, I would really encourage you to go to the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators meetings. And do you guys know Tammy Sauer's books? She wrote Chicken Dance and a lot of picture books. It is definitely an art form that you have to learn, you have to master, because there are very strict requirements that publishers set out. So definitely. But yeah, and keep writing that YA in middle grade. It just, you got to be stubborn. You have to be really stubborn to be a writer.
I started probably a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where to go from where I'm at.
Well, hopefully you can find some organizations. And SCBWI goes right on up through YA, and I'm a member, and they have a wonderful conference. Just as teachers, it might be interesting for you to go and see. They alternate between Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and they bring in editors from major publishing houses, so the big 5, which are really now the big 4 since Penguin merged with Random House. And they bring in agents, and they bring in art directors who are the picture book gurus. And you just learn a tremendous amount about what is shaping the books that you actually end up having access to work with in your classrooms. And there's a lot more going on there than you think. It is a weird world. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Thank you guys for coming. And if you want to read a copy of Dreamland and you don't have your own, the ETL has 4, so you can come check one out. And so I really appreciate Jen being here. Thank you so much, Jen, for all your work today. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. And thank you right back to all of you guys for being teachers, because I know it sounds corny, but you guys are awesome.